welcome to part 2 of this GCSE Citizenship podcast for theme 3 of the course.
Now, where was I?
So I'm now going to take the first 2 pages of theme 3 from your revision book in one go, and we're going to talk about the issues to do with international trade and the environment, because these are really important issues and they go together well. And some of the issues here link with some of the issues from theme 2 about power, politics and the media. Now, the questions here, we'll start with looking at the environment, because the environment is something that's very, very high on the political agenda, and it's something many of us are worried about. So, for example, why are more and more people using energy-saving light bulbs? Why are we concerned about insulating our homes or reducing our gas bills or getting cars that emit less pollution than the ones we had before? People are concerned about our environment, and what we want to do is try and protect it. But what kind of things affect our environment? Now, first of all, world leaders via the United Nations have worked together for many years now to try and set targets for everybody in every country as to how we can reduce the effects that climate change is having on our lives. And it began really in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where we had an Earth Summit. And this is where countries agreed to the International Agenda for Climate Change. And this was Agenda 21. And within that, they said that all of their local government also would work on a local Agenda 21. Because governments themselves at a national level can't always do everything. Local councils provide a huge number of our services. And it's very important that they also get in on the act and they do their bit to reduce environmental impact. After that, of course, came the Kyoto Treaty, Kyoto being a town in Japan, where countries agreed on the levels that they would reduce their carbon dioxide emissions by. Because CO2 emissions, which come from things like cars and taxis and buses and aeroplanes and factories and our homes, every time we turn something on, CO2 is produced at home and at the power station and through the heating of our homes. They agreed to set international targets for each country as to how much they would reduce our CO2 and climate change impact by. But what would the effects of climate change and global warming be? Many people think that, for example, as the polar ice caps melt, what will happen is that sea levels will rise. Now, for some people living, let's say, in Birmingham, that might not be a huge issue. But remember where you live. The Wirral is a peninsula. It's surrounded by water on 3 sides. And just think how easy it would be for the water levels to rise a little and say goodbye to the beaches. And then a little bit more, and parts of West Kirby, Mells, Hoylake and Caldy and Thurston are all under threat. And if they keep rising by just a metre or 2, maybe some of your houses might be under threat. Is it not worth perhaps turning that TV off standby overnight? Make a list of some of the ways you as an individual can actually have good impact on our environment and reduce your environmental impact. Take 30 seconds. Now let's move on and think about globalisation and world trade, free trade and fair trade. And this is potentially a very complex issue, but it doesn't have to be. In actual fact, it's really quite simple if you think about it in the right way, and yet an awful lot of people, particularly economists, will try and blind you with science. The world is split into 2 groups, and those of you doing geography will know this already. The richer, more powerful countries are known as MEDCs, more economically developed countries, and the rest are known as less economically developed countries, or LEDCs. Now, the UK is obviously fortunate enough to be an MEDC, and so for us that of course brings a lot of benefits and means we live in a society where we have many of the things that we do. But if you were to compare our economy and the wealth of us as individuals with those from any LEDC, you'd pretty quickly notice the difference. So, for example, taking the UK and a large country in northern Africa called Niger. Now, our populations are not that different, but if we take the amount of money that the country makes per person, in the UK, it's roughly speaking about £20,000 per year per person. In Niger, however, it's more like £120. Now, that obviously makes Niger a considerably less wealthy country than the UK. And there are other things that mark out LEDCs as well. Usually life expectancy is much shorter. So whereas on average people in our country will live to somewhere between 78 and 82, in Niger, if they reach 50, they're doing very, very well indeed. Also, of course, we have other things in MEDC, such as easy access to healthcare, free education. More of us can write and read and are literate, and we have access to things like the internet and good quality housing. And so although we have our problems, comparatively speaking, we're quite well off. Now, globalization is one of those words that you'll hear a very great deal. Essentially, what it means is that companies are able to operate almost anywhere in the world. So, for example, here in this country, we have Nissan factories building cars in Britain, up in Sunderland, but the company is actually owned by the Japanese and the French. It's the same for the Jaguar and Land Rover factory in Halewood over on Merseyside. It's actually owned by an Indian company. On the other hand, British clothes companies will often have clothes made in India and then brought back over here to sell to us. Now, why would companies do this? Why would an Indian company make cars in Britain and then export them all over the world, whilst a British clothes company would make clothes in India and then bring them back to Britain and export them over the world? See if you can make a list of 2 or 3 reasons why a company would do that. Give yourself 30 seconds. And don't forget to pause this. Now, one of the questions that you're asked on the sheet is, what is globalization? See if you can explain it in your own words. Then it's asking you to give some examples and list some advantages and disadvantages. Now, you have a few examples in pictures there, and I've talked about some. Think of some others. But think about advantages and disadvantages. An advantage, of course, is that globalization can bring development, jobs and money to LEDCs around the world. And it also means cheaper goods and services for many of us. So, for example, why not have people in India who would otherwise be unemployed making clothes for people in Britain at a much lower cost to you and I than it would be if they were made in Britain? On the other hand, you might also say that it's better to have technologically advanced things such as Jaguars and Land Rovers made in Britain, where the skills and the expertise are, and made to a very high quality, so that that quality product can be made elsewhere in the world. But there can be disadvantages to globalization as well, of course. Some companies are not as good as others at looking after their workers, and for example, there have been many issues about the Gap and how Gap clothes are made in places that can be described as sweatshops, where people are working very long hours for very low pay, sometimes in rather unsafe conditions. Now, this isn't something that will be allowed in Britain, which is another reason why companies sometimes go abroad, because not only is it cheaper to employ people, but because their rights and their working conditions are not as high as they are in more economically developed countries, companies don't have to spend as much employing them. So, is there a way around this? Of course there is. First of all, though, pause this and see if you can think of some other advantages and disadvantages of globalization. Now, finally in this part, I want to talk to you quickly about fair trade and free trade. Now, fair trade is the way many people think we can get round the downsides of globalization. What fair trade does is it guarantees producers in LEDCs a set price and a fair price for their product. And it also gives them a set extra amount of money to develop things in their communities, such as water wells in villages in Ghana that produce cocoa for our chocolate. And traditionally, fair trade products were more expensive than regular products, but that price gap has narrowed, and sometimes now, often they're the same price or maybe even less, because fair trade can be very efficient. For example, under fair trade, you can invest in your crops so that you don't get disease, and they will still work for you and grow for you. The cooperative is a really good shop that sells an awful lot of fair trade products. Next time you go, look out for them. And finally, free trade is a system whereby countries, particularly wealthy countries, don't put large taxes on goods that come from developing countries so that they are more expensive for people in wealthy countries to buy. Free trade enables access to rich markets from poor countries. So why not look at those questions on that sheet? What is fair trade? Give some examples and list some advantages and disadvantages of that and of free trade as well. And when you've done that, why not go to part 3, which is the last part of this podcast.